a few minutes, yeah?
Yeah. Very.
Hi, good morning.
Hi, Alexandra. So, just letting you know, Andre's filming this live stream session. That's right. There's only two mics. That one. It's very simple. So, I think we'll do the 5 minutes and ask the questions from the audience. Jump up or shout loud. Right, okay, so
Thank you for trying to figure out what each of us talk about.
No, I just said what? No, I didn't.
I just looked at it.
Fine,
yeah,
fine.
so we
I
thought,
need to talk
And then you
about
talk
evaluation.
so I'll open, then you, and then finish. And then we'll go to questions.
My big concern today is the lunch hour is 12:30 to 1:30 and the AGM is 12:30.
Yeah, so watch out for eat while you sit.
Oh, it's the food. Oh,
Yeah,
just bring it in.
right, yeah, just bring it
Oh, I
in.
see. I wasn't going to comment here, so I wasn't going to ask.
Yeah. No, it is.
I'm not very good at this. Sometimes
I know, you're
in
not
the middle of the day.
Yeah, I think so. We'll just get started.
Right.
Sandra.
I think there should be a new award for only people eligible will be those who speak without any harm. Yes. For this? Yeah, right. No, I decided to go. The other thing probably is as you get the further you get, my oldest size is pretty good.
Can I just suggest people might want to move down to the front? It's a little hard to hear at the
Tennis
back,
screen is sort of midway.
particularly when we get to the roving mic stage. Okay. We might get started. It looks like all those that are coming are here. Welcome to this Columbus Hall. If you're here for this session for the first time, my name is Lucy Brogden and I'm the Chair of the National Mental Health Commission in Australia, and very pleased to be here and to be chairing this session with such eminent colleagues in our field. It's a great honour for me. We are going to just hear from each speaker for about 5 minutes on their approaches and discourse around national strategies, and then we'll open it up to the floor for a lot of questions. And I think the thing that's been particularly interesting for me, I went to the National Strategy Workshop, is that I see slides up there that give Australia a tick for having a national strategy, and that somewhat intrigues me because we don't really have one. We're doing a lot of activity, but we haven't pulled it under a strategy. And I think, as some people have noted in earlier presentations over the last couple of days, the planets seem to be aligning for our sector a little bit, that finally governments are hearing the message that this requires investment and more significant investment than we've had in the past. And in Australia particularly, we're very pleased that our Prime Minister, the Chief Minister, has appointed a special advisor to himself on suicide prevention. That's Christine Morgan, our CEO of the National Mental Health Commission, and asked her to come back with a whole-of-government approach to suicide prevention across Australia, but also reached out to the state government and territories for a whole-of-governance conversation as well. We see that in our system, people fall through the cracks at the intersection between state, commonwealth and local government services and the private system. So that's a very exciting development for us, and I think we'll be then looking forward to seeing a very legitimate tick on the matrices of countries with strategies following the World Health Organisation models. The other big development that we're very excited about in Australia is investment from our Commonwealth Government for a true national monitoring data system, which we haven't had. Often people on the ground in our communities are relying on grey systems, Excel spreadsheets, shadow systems to capture data and inform strategy, where our government data is often 2 years old at best. So to be moving to a sentinel monitoring approach is quite exciting. We're taking a very iterative response to that, but we're looking to build in ambulance data, police data, the coronial data, ED presentations, suicide and self-harm, and hopefully start to also bring in some measures around psychological distress and wellbeing in our communities and match some of this data to really build a useful tool for government policy at the highest level, but down to local suicide prevention networks in the community and being able to build responsive strategies. So that's the Australian perspective. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the panellists. First up, known to probably everybody in the room, Alexandra Fleischmann from the World Health Organisation. Alexandra is a clinical and health psychologist who defended her doctoral dissertation at the University of Vienna. She has held positions at the University Clinic for Medical Psychology and Psychotherapy in Graz, Austria, and the University Institute of Psychology in Zurich in Switzerland. But for the past 20 years, where most of us are aware of her incredible work, with the World Health Organisation in Geneva. Alexandra will be speaking first, then followed by Stephen Platt, probably known to everybody in this room as well, for his incredible body of work based out of the University of Edinburgh, but having done work with a number of organisations in public policy, but also with the NGO space, as I saw as an advisor to Samaritans for many years, and consultant to the Irish National Office of Suicide Prevention, so a very broad view. He's the current Vice Chair of the IAS Special Interest Group on the development of effective national suicide prevention strategies and practice, and currently co-convener and chair of the evaluation support for Scotland. And I think that's the really critical element to use the evaluation models for all of us at every level. And then to wrap up our session will be Mort Silverman, who's the Director of Student Counselling and Resource Centre at the University of Chicago from 1987 to 2002, 1996 to 2009, Editor-in-Chief of Suicide and Life-Threatening Behaviour, 2002 to 2013, member of the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention Scientific Council. Dr. Silverman is a Distinguished Life Fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, a member of the International Association for Suicide Research, co-author of over 50 peer-reviewed publications and 30 book chapters, and co-author of the comprehensive textbook of suicidology and adolescent suicide assessment and intervention. So please welcome all of our panellists, and we'll start with Alexandra. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So why a national suicide prevention strategy? In the era of UN Sustainable Development Goals, the answer is quite clear. Governments committed themselves to achieve those goals by the year 2030, which is to reduce suicide rates. And so you're welcome and invited to go back to your countries and reach out to your governments and remind them of this commitment. And we all have to work together on that. Of course, we also know that why having a national strategy is important. It not only signifies the commitment of a government to reduce suicide rates, it also should then make the necessary human and financial resources available and to implement the effective evidence-based interventions and to set the research agenda and bring the different stakeholders together. Now, in the WHO 2014 report, Preventing Suicide, a Global Imperative, we already addressed the issue of national strategies, and we gave different settings or scenarios where countries all can start suicide prevention no matter where they currently stand. So even if there's nothing that happened so far, there are things a government can start with, and if you have a few actions, you can continue and consolidate your efforts. And if you already have the national strategy implemented, you should invest to improve it and work intensively on the evaluation. And at that time, in 2014, we knew of 28 countries with a national suicide prevention strategy. And by now, there are 38 countries known to have such a strategy. And what we are now starting to work on, and for the coming years, is to provide guidance to other countries who are not that far as yet, who are on the way of developing a strategy. And so what is the guidance that we can give? And I really call upon you and for this session to provide your inputs and idea how such guidance could look like. I think the one important thing is to bring the different stakeholders together. And this is something we repeatedly say, but it's reminding me of the theme of this Congress. It's building bridges from the practitioner's point of view and of the everyday work of an NGO or someone who works in academia to build a bridge to the government. And if you have listened to the panel session this morning to Dr. Nav Kapoor, where he said what policymakers want to receive, it's not the document in written, maybe very long, it's not the little film where someone presents the latest research, it's this little infographic that summarizes the research of many years. But this is a way to communicate to the government leadership and policymakers of what needs to be done. So you have those 5 minutes, usually with the minister, ideally, but to better communicate what is needed, because in the end, the Ministry of Health, when implementing a national strategy, they rely on all of the people working in suicide prevention in the country. So they then need to reach out to you, the practitioners, the academia, the researchers, to help the government implement suicide prevention. So this communication has to be a two-way one, and it has to be started or strengthened. So in a way, another issue is that in suicide prevention we have to work across the different sectors, and the guidance we want to develop then also has to include that, really step by step, multi-sectoral collaboration. What does it mean? How do I reach out to another sector? How do I have a first meeting with another sector? How do I bring them to the table? So in a way, we have to consolidate our knowledge of those countries who already have a national strategy to make this knowledge available to other countries who are on their way in suicide prevention, and to basically have a knowledge transfer happening. And this is why I think now it's time to move to our next speaker, where we talk about the evaluation. What do we, of those countries who already have a national strategy, what is their experience? What can they say about the evaluation? And how can then the knowledge transfer happen to all the other countries in the future? Thank you.
Okay. Right. Thank you for the opportunity to talk here. The Scottish experience, 2002, Scotland launched its national strategy, Choose Life, which was to last for 10 years from 2003. And looking at changes in suicide rates over that period, usually taking multiple numbers of years because of fluctuations from year on year, it looks as if the target of a 20% reduction in that time was achieved. It's quite remarkable. Scotland has become a kind of role model for many people from other places. They look at the change in the suicide rate and they say, this is incredible. By the way, we're saying more or less the same happened in England, which has a different program. But sticking with Scotland, so how come? You've done lots of different things. I understand your program is, as all best programs should be, in suicide prevention at national level. It's multifaceted, it's multi-component, it's multi-sectoral, it's multi-everything, it's layered, it's local, it's national, and so on. So I'm really keen to set up a program to move from disparate activities to a program in my country. What can you tell us about why has it been successful? And if there's so many components, it's likely that some have contributed to this change, some have not, and perhaps even some have actually been deleterious. They've actually backfired. The extraordinary thing is, as someone who's a researcher and been an advisor to the Scottish Government for a long time, despite the best efforts of mine and many other people, we don't know the answer to any of these questions. That's because although there was some interest in evaluation in the early days, in fact the Commission 2, it's hard to know whether to call them implementation evaluations or more formative evaluations. They were of implementation with a view to improving the quality and extent of implementation. They covered the first 3 years, and I led that program, and then another team led a program of evaluation on the subsequent 2 years. So we had some information on the first 5 years, so that took us to about 2008, and now it's a decade later. And there's been we don't know any more about the implementation side, and we know nothing, we can say nothing about what might be the active ingredients that have made the difference in Scotland, if any. Because the other issue is it got anything to do with the programme at all? Is this an association rather than a causal contribution? And without some kind of summative evaluation, it's very difficult to say. The other problem is that the Scotland model, which is a very interesting model, delegated most authority or responsibility for action to local areas, 32 local government areas, which had their own strategic teams set up through the planning process and were responsible for oversight and delivery of programmes at local level. But there was no real control over these programmes, so there's a lot of things that were done which may have absolutely nothing to do with suicide prevention, and a mix of those which were successful or not, but with the likely problem that many of them never achieved the scale, even locally, to make a difference. So we know very little about it. It's frustrating beyond belief. So with the obsession that many programmes have, or many governments have, about just watching the key indicator change, either suicide rate and perhaps the self-harm, hospital treated self-harm rate, or community self-harm rate is available, fall over time. It doesn't tell you anything about the reasons why, and there's no learning which arises from it. The other thing to say is that in 2018, in both England and Scotland, they'd have two different systems for dealing with sudden and unexplained deaths and for recording them and so on. In 2018, the numbers jumped by 15%. And while I wouldn't for a second accept that you could take 1 year as a trend, when I look back over the previous 30 or 40 years, there was only one other period where 2 successive years showed a change of that magnitude. So this is unusual, and it may be the start of something different. It looks as if Scotland's bottomed out. So at least plateaued and perhaps maybe reversing. But again, we don't know why, because we're not set up to understand why. Okay, so how can an evaluation perspective enhance the likelihood of a successful programme? One is some of these are maybe obvious, and many of them may be obvious, but they're not necessarily followed through. One is we need greater attention paid to the content of programmes. So what's the rationale for the selection of activities? Is it based on an evidence base? And does it include the range of universal, selective and indicated approaches for which there is some evidence? As a sideline, I would say, by the way, that the extent to which we really know what works as for components of national programmes is a contested issue, should I say. We know certain things beyond any doubt, including restricting access to means, but there are many other areas where the jury is still out, and more research is needed, but it's treated as if we have, I think at times, a lot more evidence about effectiveness than in fact I believe we do. Secondly, we need to recognise the importance of engaging key stakeholders, and not only for the reason that they need to be involved in the development and working together to provide a coherent programme, but also you need to understand what the theories of change that they're working with, and to make sure that the overall theory that you're working with as a whole programme is coherent and based around what we would call logic model or theory of change, so that you know something about what's the likely route to the long-term aims of reducing suicide and self-harm from the inputs and resources through the activities, through engagement with different groups, through short-term, intermediate and long-term outcomes. And in Scotland this was never done, and still hasn't been done. You need to assess the effectiveness of individual elements of the programme as well as the programme as a whole. So what components have contributed to success? And the failure to demonstrate the effectiveness of individual components definitely undermines our confidence that any change that occurs can be attributed to that component or the programme as a whole. So you need evaluation both at programme level, which is extremely challenging, but also at the level of major components. Next, you need to recognise the limits of how you go about evaluating these programmes. And I'll say more about that, putting in a plug for a session we're doing on development, implementation, evaluation of national programmes at 5 o'clock today. So there's a seminar, which I'll cover some of that, about what kind of approaches, but you need a more realist approach where you're trying to understand what particular mechanisms trigger what particular outcomes in what particular conditions. And there is a danger of over-reliance on experimental or quasi-experimental approaches. You need to encourage research-mindedness and obtain a commitment to evaluation from the start. It's not something that you can bolt on. You need to, and keeping the focus on the big picture is really important. We get wrapped up in the difficulties of trying to evaluate the components, but we need to keep an eye on the big picture, because the key argument, in my view, for national programmes is the synergy and connectedness and the sum being greater than the parts argument for a national programme. But what evidence do we have of that? Very little indeed. Keep the focus on the big picture, consider appropriate research designs, and invest thoroughly in an appraisal of process and implementation, which should be a continuous process with a feedback loop so that implementation is effective and is able to change in the course of the rollout of the programme. My final one is don't be frightened of complexity. It can be quite scary, but I think unless you recognise the complexity of the national programme, we're never going to have a research design which can give us some understanding and learning based on evaluation studies. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to thank Siobhan, Barry, and Rory for inviting me to participate in this session this morning. The invitation says you can have 5 minutes. I wasn't sure whether it meant 5 minutes of fame or 5 minutes of what. I mean, Andy Warhol got his 15 minutes, I have my 5. So, and the good news, no PowerPoints. I was very pleased about not bringing any of them this year, and I'm hoping that you appreciate that as much as I do. The problem that I have is that I'm really stuck between a rock and a hard place. And what do I mean by that? On the one hand, I believe very much in public health campaigns and public health interventions, public health messaging, and I believe very strongly in all forms of prevention, whether it's universal, indicated, or selected. And I happen to have been involved from this process from the very beginning when, back in the 1980s, I was a member of the committee that wrote the first UN WHO guidelines for suicide prevention at the national level. Subsequently involved in both the first iteration and the second iteration of the U.S. national suicide prevention strategies. That's on one hand. On the other hand, at this point in my career, and I've been at this a while, as you can tell by my hair, I believe my ongoing contributions at this point really is to be somewhat of a curmudgeon and somewhat of a critical voice in looking at where we are and what we've done and what we've yet to do. And Steve actually covered some of that already, but let me elaborate a bit. We have to get back to the basic fact that suicide is a behavior, and all behavior is multi-determined, multifactorial, and therefore we can't absolutely identify the specific set of signs or symptoms that lead to someone dying by suicide. So if you don't have very specific targets of intervention, and if you're not sure that they work, and you know they don't work for everybody, developing a national suicide prevention program has to take the form of trying to do something for everyone. So there's a little bit, and most of the programs focus on training, on community involvement, on school interventions, et cetera, et cetera. And we have to appreciate the fact that suicides just don't occur in one age group. And what I find missing in a lot of these efforts is a developmental perspective. That what you start doing in, if you will, the school system needs to carry over to the workplace, needs to carry over to the community, needs to carry over to people in retirement. And the messages, though they can evolve depending on the age group you're working with or the location of your intervention, they need to be linked in some way. That you need to be giving the same messages across the lifespan. And I don't see that happening in too many of the national strategies, and I don't always see that happening in more broad-based interventions that are being promulgated. The other part of this is that we know that suicide doesn't exist in a vacuum. We know that it's associated with or correlated with things like domestic violence, like substance abuse problems, childhood adversity issues, the economy, jobs, lack of jobs, migration, and things of that sort. And what I find missing in a lot of these strategies is the appreciation that we need to incorporate the work being done in these other strategies that are addressing these other problems. That it's all well and good, and believe me, I'm an advocate of having a national strategy for suicide prevention. I think what we're missing is recognizing that we need to collaborate and work more closely with those other national prevention programs and those other national efforts that are addressing the behaviors that cross over, if you will, influence suicidal behavior. And I don't always see that happening. That we don't, if you will, reach across the corridor and develop programs that overlap or incorporate the best of what's going on in the substance abuse prevention world or the domestic violence world, et cetera, et cetera. What else? What are my other complaints? Just a few. We can talk about other ones later. But let me leave you with questions that I ask myself before I go to bed at night. Because I can't answer them, I usually fall asleep. So here they are. Is our goal really to prevent suicide? Yes. But what about preventing suicidal ideation? How do you do that? Suicide attempts, and how do you do that? Self-harm, and how do you do that? And if you look at a lot of these strategies, what is the outcome that we always hold up is death by suicide. And I have to wonder and ask whether or not we're going after the Holy Grail too soon. That maybe what we should be doing is thinking about approaching this problem and looking at doing something about attempts and self-harm and these other acts, for that matter, alcohol and drug abuse and domestic violence, child abuse, which are all precursors or correlated with that final outcome of suicide. And in my view, unless we start thinking about that, holding out that end result as the whole purpose of the strategy may lead us to fail. And one thing we don't want to do is be funded for a national strategy and to get involved in national strategies only to, quote unquote, fail at what we're doing. So that's one. And I have another minute? Another minute, okay. And this touches a lot upon what you've already heard, but when evaluating the success of a strategy, should we not also be measuring the success of other health indicators that are common and associated with suicidal behaviors? For example, in the United States, we're not doing so great with our suicide rate. It's going up. Now we're on our second national strategy, which I think is very good strategy. But maybe what we should be looking at first is how are we doing with our other national prevention programs, and whether that there's progress being made there, such that as those programs show good results, they will result in our programs showing good results in time. That things don't change overnight, behavior doesn't change overnight, and unless you address some of these other associated problems, we may not be able to really say that we've done anything about that worst outcome, death by suicide. And finally, I think it's important, as Steve already had mentioned and as Alexander mentioned, partnerships. We really need to work with as many people as possible in the public health world, in the clinical world, in the world of community workers. We can't go this alone. It should not always befall the mental health world to fix the problem. And I don't always see efforts being made to really think more broadly, such as motor vehicle problems, motor vehicle world, engineers who design some of these issues that result in death by suicide. So we've got to take a step back and think more broadly about where we're going, how we're going to get there, and not put such a tight timeline on getting there until we've also looked at improving some of these other issues as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we've got about half an hour for questions, 25 minutes for questions. There's one mic. So can we try and ask our questions really loud from the floor so I can pass the microphone across here? rather than move them up. If that doesn't work, we'll go to plan B. But thank you all, three of you. I think you've really touched on some very important points in the development and maintenance of national strategies. Evaluation is so important to know what we're doing. I sit in the land of working with the policymakers and answering to government, and governments consistently say, we put more money in and look at the numbers. Should we stop spending money? And we don't want them to do that. But it's a real challenge because we don't have the answer to the why question, which is the key one that they ask. And I think to Mort's point around looking at other strategies, for the first time in Australia, we were invited to have input into the development of the National Injury Prevention Strategy. And it was fascinating for us. We went along as sort of outsiders and actually became the central part of the conversation, with all other injury prevention specialists saying, oh, we've got something to add to that conversation. So I think that's an exciting development. So much of, we've talked regularly in these fora about social determinants of health and how important they are. But the key learning for me, and I'm slow and new to this, is that actually when you go and talk to our health agencies, they have no levers in the social determinants of health. So they're kind of scared of that conversation and often move to a very medicalised model, which those of us that come from the lived experience space find somewhat confronting and a closed door. So to be moving to more of a whole of government approach, whole of issue approach, I think in coming upstream, as you're saying, more, if we're tackling, we know from the OECD, the World Health Organisation, London School of Economics, our best buys in this space are parenting strategies, reducing adverse childhood experiences, and reducing issues around trauma. But we keep coming right down to the crisis all the time, and so taking that opportunity to step back and look at the tools of the World Health Organisation around some of these are really important. So throwing it to the floor now for questions. I'm sure there are many. At the back. Loud voice, Jaylee.
Thank you very much. You speaking seems unusual. I guess I've got two questions, maybe to go on some stuff that Mort and Steve said. I think Mort, you mentioned about how we might connect some of those other national strategies around violence prevention, alcohol and drug harm reduction, childhood diversity. Have you got any advice about how you do that, how you connect some of those approaches to suicide prevention strategies? We have an opportunity to do that in Australia, or anyone that's done it really well. And secondly, I guess my question to Steve is, if you're going to that broad approach, how would you set up an evaluation strategy from the start? Two questions.
So we're live streaming this session, so I'm just going to repeat the question a little, paraphrase it. One is, how do we connect strategies in adjacent spaces, directed to Mort, and then how do we build an evaluation model that's directed to Steve?
Jaylee, why do you always ask the tough questions? I don't have an answer for that one, other than to say that we need leaders who, if you will, think outside the box or have no box at all to think about, to recognize that this is a bigger problem than we make it out to be, and that there's many more components that we've got to consider. One thing I didn't mention, at least in the States, the highest suicide rate is amongst the elderly. What are we doing about the elderly and taking care of the elderly in our communities? We're not doing, at least in my opinion, doing a great job of it in the States. Why are we then surprised that we may have a higher rate? And for our adolescents who are also at high risk, what are we doing about transitions and from school to the workplace, from school to marriage, from school to other activities or their developmental process? What are we doing to address that issue for them? Are we getting them jobs? Are we giving them a sense of a future and a sense of hope? And if we're not doing that, then why are we so surprised that so many of them are hopeless and depressed and in a state of despair? What I would love to see is an effort either out of the public health community or the mental health community to put pressure to have a national committee or some leadership activity that pulls together all these issues and acknowledges that we're not silos in all of this, but we really are talking about behaviors that can be addressed, that can be prevented, that can be modified, but we can't take them in isolation. Sure.
I'm working with the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse. So alcohol has a global strategy to reduce the harmful use of alcohol, which member states adopted. And there are 3 best buys to reduce harmful use of alcohol. And the Global Status Report on Alcohol and Health tells us that 1/5 of all suicides globally are caused by alcohol consumption. So 1/5. So that's another area we would have to reach out to.
Yeah, I think this is a system problem. If you're going to have a joined-up approach, I mean, you know, the jargon is a joined-up approach to suicide prevention because it's so multi, as we've all said. The problem is how government is often organised, and I think one of the tricks is how do you prevent the obvious, which is that suicide prevention becomes the major responsibility of the health department. And although then the issue is getting buy-in from all the other departments, because they've got to be persuaded that they don't see where transport or employment or anything else fits into the logic model, as it were, of understanding the determinants of suicide. If you can actually establish at cabinet level you need somebody, some kind of SAR who would oversee it, but a collective responsibility. I think that makes a great difference, because you're trying to get round what's the endemic problem in all government, which is the silos and the departmental responsibilities. So every department, virtually every department, has to somehow take responsibility and have a place in a national programme and be held accountable for that. As far as evaluation, how you build it in, I mean, we always say the obvious things about building it in from the start, and there's been a change in the last, I think, 10 or 20 years towards more acceptance of evaluation and the role and importance of evaluation. But that doesn't mean that the resources are necessarily there, nor does it mean that the right people, often in government, they don't have the evaluation skills. You need to go out to the evaluation methodology community, and they cut across all disciplines and all topic areas, and involve them in some way, or insist that they're involved in order to plan an evaluation to programme level. And I think that's quite separate from any evaluation of specific components, but it needs somebody with the imagination to be able to do that. So in a sense, that joined-upness becomes a joined-upness and a research-mindedness both become central to the way that a programme is delivered.
Great, thank you. More questions? Yes. Yeah, can you try and shout otherwise? So the question from Alice Colkin is, how do we get the collaboration to happen? And there are models of that starting to emerge, and credit to Tasmania in Australia for
Just
that.
keep passing the mic forward.
But I'll keep passing them around and we'll go round and round. But I think, I mean, this is one of the challenges. One of the other things we're doing in Australia is we've got a productivity commission review happening at the moment, which is looking at the economic costs of both mental health and suicide to our community. And as that data comes out, you see ministers starting to say, this is costing me, but with our model of government funding, the person that invests doesn't realise the saving. And, you know, we hear that line, the paradox of prevention is when it succeeds, nothing happens. And actually, you know, in our space, when it succeeds, something powerful happens. Lives are saved, people go on to live incredibly contributing lives, and I think that's the story we've got to find a way of telling, but I'll ask the experts.
Can you just read?
How do we create the collaboration?
Well, incentives are good, and by that I mean just cash. I'm sort of refer you back to my previous answer. It's about a system approach and an understanding of whether it's at local level or national. I'm thinking of an example of maybe at local level, where the key people who need to be involved have to be persuaded about the importance of the topic. And I think two ways of doing that. One is that there's an incentive to be involved in this, and it might be through the way that the job is described and the job is rewarded. But second of all, I think it's about trying to link that work with other work. We've talked about the importance of, for instance, relation to alcohol. I mean, suicide is a rare event. We talk about it all the time, and I know it gives offence a bit, but in terms of the numbers compared to, say, the number of people who are affected by alcohol, you have to be able to cross-link and show, I think, that this work, if it's successful, it will not only pay off in terms of suicide prevention, but it will also be a contribution to mental health promotion, alleviation of alcohol-related problems and so on. So that interlinkage and gaining something across a wide range of public health problems would be quite valuable.
I can't disagree. Let me just take a slightly different angle on this. The issue of political will and what is going to change things. In the United States, I've been incredibly impressed with two movements that have occurred, at least during my career in suicide prevention. One, survivors who have lost a loved one to suicide. That movement has incredibly pushed the national agenda in the area of suicide prevention. And the other movement, which is now only a few years old, but I think is going to be very powerful, is those people who have had lived experience with suicide and suicide attempts. Those two groups are very large, and those two groups have a voice, and those two groups are incredibly invested in what we're trying to do. And we need their advice, their input, their political will to help move the agenda in a direction that will be good for everybody.
Yeah, I can only chime in with that with regard to lived experience. I was at the session yesterday. It was very impressive. And also, to my recollection, lived experience was at the beginning of the US strategy early on with a couple, Elsie and Cherry Wyra, who lost a loved one. And so I think this is an important aspect. But other things that came to my mind was, again, the infographics, but repeatedly giving briefings, information, showing the linkages, as was already mentioned, and the political will, the moving it to the cabinet office. I think Japan has an experience in that, which shows to the public that it's the highest priority in the country.
Thanks, Alexandra. More questions? Yes, Richard, loud voice.
So I think it's clear that A national strategy can't be effective if it's not being implemented. So my question for you all, what do you think are the best examples of nations that have been able to track or monitor in some way whether the activities they were recommended were actually happening?
Okay, so examples of good implemented strategies.
I find it quite hard to. I mean, there's studies from the States, there's studies from Australia. I think those, but the issue is, part of the problem is the lack of evidence. So we might be able to cite countries which have invested in implementation evaluation, and that's a step better than not evaluating at all. And some of that work will identify areas which have been successful and are likely to have made a contribution, and others where there have been problems and so on. But I think the number of examples that we have to go on are very few. But that doesn't mean to say that implementation hasn't been happening. Clearly it has. But what's the intensity? What's the quality? I think, I'm sort of crying out for more information.
Again, I'll take a slightly different view on all this. Many of you, I'm sure, know about in the United States the U.S. Air Force Suicide Prevention Program, which was very successful, comprehensive, multi-layered, multifactorial, directed at a very specific population, but nevertheless went about it wholeheartedly, and that program has been evaluated. Actually, Kerry Knox, KNOX, wrote one of the definitive evaluations of that, pointing out what seemed to have worked in that multi-level strategy and what didn't. Eric Kane, who is here as well at the conference, was one of the other co-authors behind evaluating that program. But what I want to say about it is that yes, it was effective, yes, the rates went down, but then the rates went back up. And the question was, well, such a successful program, why did the rates go back up? They went back and looked at it, and why? Because people moved on. People in leadership positions took other positions. Those people who were committed to the program and started the program are no longer in the program, teaching or supervising or providing services in the program. And other priorities came down the line in the U.S. Air Force, which were then taking precedent. So suicide prevention was not their number one activity. However, once they found out that the rates were going back up, they reinvested in the program, learned from what they had done before and what was evaluated, and once they placed the emphasis back on the program, the rates went back down again. So my message about all this is that we're in it for the long haul, and people do come and go, and people in power come and go, and etc. But there has to be a long-term commitment that is consistent. And if that doesn't happen, then these elements that we're talking about, we may never be able to determine whether any of them over time make a difference or not.
Yeah, it's a challenge because when I'm saying you're so in so many countries and don't have national strategies, some of them may be there on paper, but not implemented. So the implementation is a huge issue, and this is why we would like to provide more guidance on that. And good examples is there was a pre-conference workshop, and later this evening there will be a symposium on national strategies, and just from that I think there are some good examples. There will be a presentation from Ireland, from Japan, we just heard from the US, and then sometimes it's within a country that you can find good examples where something has worked very well.
Thank you. We've probably got time for one more question before the break. There's one. Yes? Can you try loud? Otherwise.
Yes, I'm fine. So my name's David Moss, and I chair a local suicide prevention group in North London. And I was just reflecting, listening to this very interesting conversation about the difference between agenda setting nationally, strategies, and implementation. The national strategy in England is to have local suicide, to delegate the implementation to local bodies. And the local bodies are these places where this integration of different agencies is to take place. But the national strategy itself as an agenda is influenced by things that happen locally and things that happen in the voluntary sector, which generates ideas that then feed into the national agenda setting. So I think we've got, it seems, a much more dynamic process that links what happens nationally to what happens locally, to what happens inside the statutory system, to what happens outside the statutory system, than the idea of a national strategy that then gets implemented. And I'm wondering how, in thinking about this, we can engage with what is actually a very dynamic and shifting process that experience. It's something which, in a sense, the idea of national strategies almost fails to capture. It's interesting to know what the panel think about that.
Thank you. And I think that's a really important point because we have a top-down, bottom-up approach, so it's very dynamic. A national strategy at the top. Many countries are moving to local suicide prevention groups, networks to really own and drive the activity in their community. They're generally very well engaged with lived experience, the not-for-profit, the NGO sector, as well as government services. And how do we keep that dynamic, virtuous circle of energy informing the top, feeding to the bottom and supporting the bottom?
Yeah, you have to see country by country because you have those countries who have many scattered programs and activities and where you with the experience that you didn't have the national strategy. So you had at province, state level, you had many things happening and they were striving for having maybe ultimately reach the national strategy, which was good for them because then they found coordination, they found exchange of experience, learning from each other, and having this government commitment and also potentially financing. So, but you also have countries where it's the other way around, where the national government acknowledges suicide as being a problem, comes up with a national strategy, but then when they want to implement, they find themselves being confronted with the situation where they need local implementation. So where then you see this movement from the national action to the local planning and action taking. So it's really country by country, can have different scenarios, but in the end, we need this dynamic and working together.
Can I just add, my experience in Scotland, there's a lot of top-down and there's very, very, very little of bottom-up. And I wouldn't go so far as to say, I don't feel I yet know in relation to what's happening in Ireland, but there's a lot of information, a lot of expectations that pass down, and expectation that the weight of the burden of responsibility for delivery is at local level. But actually, trying to think of examples where that local level practice and evaluation and learning has gone back up and affected changes at national level, I think there's again another system problem there, and I bet you that's quite common in many other countries as well.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for your attendance and participation in the discussion today. Joining